the invisible patterns that shape our world. The evening sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of the French countryside, painting the landscape in a palette of muted greens and golds. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like any other peaceful summer evening in 1944. But hidden within those shadows, within the very fabric of the landscape itself, lay an intricate deception that would help turn the tide of World War II. As Allied forces prepared for the D-Day invasion, they faced a monumental challenge: how to conceal the massive buildup of troops and equipment from German reconnaissance. The solution came from an unlikely source: a group of artists, set designers, and magicians who understood the principles of visual perception better than anyone. They knew that the human mind doesn't perceive the world as it truly is, but rather as a series of patterns and relationships. And by manipulating those patterns, they could make entire armies disappear. This is the power of Gestalt Principles, a set of rules that govern how our brains organize visual information into coherent wholes. But these principles extend far beyond the realm of optical illusions and camouflage. They shape our understanding of everything, from subway maps to gourmet meals, from advertising to user interface design. To truly grasp the world around us, we must first understand how we perceive it. The birth of a revolution in perception. In the early 20th century, a group of German psychologists stumbled upon a profound insight. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. This seemingly simple observation would go on to revolutionize our understanding of human perception and cognition. Picture, if you will, a dimly lit laboratory in Berlin, circa 1910. A young researcher named Max Wertheimer is staring intently at a primitive animation device, watching two lines flicker on and off in rapid succession. But instead of seeing two separate lines, Wertheimer perceives a single line moving back and forth. This phenomenon, which he dubs the phi effect, becomes the catalyst for an entirely new school of psychology. Wertheimer and his colleagues, Kurt Koffka and Wolfgang Kohler, begin to explore the ways in which our minds actively organize and interpret sensory information. They reject the prevailing notion that perception is a simple, bottom-up process of assembling individual elements. Instead, they argue that our brains are constantly seeking to impose order and meaning on the chaotic stream of data flooding our senses. This new approach, which they call Gestalt psychology, from the German word for shape or form, posits that the mind has an innate tendency to perceive patterns and wholes rather than disconnected parts. It's as if our brains are equipped with a kind of perceptual autocomplete function, filling in gaps and smoothing out inconsistencies to create a coherent picture of reality. But here's the rub. This automatic organizing process, while incredibly useful for navigating the world, can also lead us astray. Our minds are so eager to find patterns that we sometimes see them where none exist, like faces in clouds or conspiracies in random events. Understanding Gestalt principles, then, isn't just about explaining optical illusions. It's about gaining insight into the very nature of human cognition, with all its strengths and limitations. The principles that guide our perception. Now let's dive into the nitty-gritty of Gestalt psychology. There are several key principles that describe how our brains organize visual information, but we'll focus on the most fundamental ones. 1. Proximity. Elements that are close together are perceived as belonging to the same group. Imagine a crowded party where people naturally cluster into conversation circles. Your brain does the same thing with visual elements, grouping nearby objects together even if they're not physically connected. 2. Similarity. Objects that share visual characteristics, like color, shape, or size, are seen as related. This is why you can instantly pick out all the red M&Ms from a bowl of mixed colors, or why a flock of birds in flight appears as a single entity despite being composed of individual animals. 3. Closure. Our brains have a tendency to complete incomplete shapes or patterns. This is why you can still read a word with missing letters, or why you can recognize a face from a simple line drawing. Your mind fills in the gaps to create a whole that makes sense. 4. Continuity. We perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than disjointed ones. If you see a curved line intersecting with a straight line, you're more likely to perceive two complete lines crossing rather than 4 separate line segments meeting at a point. 5. Figure ground. We naturally distinguish between the main focus of an image, the figure, and its background, the ground. This principle explains why you can see either a vase or 2 faces in the classic optical illusion, but not both simultaneously. These principles might seem abstract, but they have profound implications for how we interact with the world. Let's explore how they've been applied in 3 very different domains: military strategy, urban design, and culinary arts. Case Study 1. The Art of Disappearance. Let's return to that French countryside in 1944. The Allied forces faced a daunting task: how to hide an invasion force of over 150,000 troops and thousands of vehicles from German aerial reconnaissance. The solution came in the form of Operation Fortitude, one of the most ambitious deception campaigns in military history. At the heart of this operation was a keen understanding of Gestalt principles, particularly figure-ground relationships and closure. The Allied forces created elaborate fake army camps, complete with inflatable tanks and plywood aircraft. From the air, these props looked convincingly real. The German observers' brains automatically filled in the missing details, perceiving complete military units where none actually existed. But the real stroke of genius came in how these fake installations were positioned. By carefully arranging decoys across southeastern England, the Allies manipulated the principle of proximity to create the illusion of a massive army poised to invade Calais. Meanwhile, the actual invasion force gathering in southwestern England was disguised using the principle of similarity. Real tanks and troops were camouflaged to blend in with their surroundings, breaking up their familiar shapes and making them harder for the eye to distinguish from the landscape. The result was a perceptual sleight of hand on a massive scale. The German High Command, their perception shaped by these carefully orchestrated visual cues, became convinced that the main Allied thrust would come at Calais. When the real invasion landed at Normandy, they initially dismissed it as a diversion, giving the Allies the crucial foothold they needed to turn the tide of the war. This example illustrates a crucial point about Gestalt principles. They operate at a subconscious level, influencing our perceptions and decisions, even when we're not aware of them. The German observers weren't consciously thinking about proximity or closure. They were simply seeing what their brains told them was there. By understanding and manipulating these principles, the Allies were able to exploit the very cognitive mechanisms that usually help us make sense of the world. Case Study 2. Mapping the Labyrinth. Now, let's fast forward a few decades and shift our focus from the battlefields of Europe to the bustling streets of London. In 1931, a young engineering draftsman named Harry Beck was pondering a problem: how to make sense of the city's increasingly complex underground railway system. The existing tube maps were a mess. They attempted to accurately represent the geographic locations of stations, resulting in a cluttered and confusing tangle of lines. Beck, in a stroke of insight, realized that geographic accuracy was less important than clarity and ease of use. He decided to create a new kind of map, one that prioritized the relationships between stations over their physical locations. Beck's design was a masterclass in the application of Gestalt principles, particularly continuity and similarity. He straightened out the twisting rail lines, using only horizontal, vertical, and 45-degree diagonal lines. This made the map much easier for the brain to process, as it aligned with our natural tendency to perceive smooth, continuous patterns. He also used color coding to distinguish between different lines, leveraging the principle of similarity to help viewers quickly group related information. Stations were represented by simple dots or rectangles, with interchanges shown as circles, again, using similarity to indicate function. Perhaps most importantly, Beck's map completely ignored geographic scale. The centrally located stations were spaced further apart, while outlying stations were compressed. This distortion, while technically inaccurate, made the map much more usable by emphasizing the information that was most relevant to travelers, the sequence of stations and the connections between lines. When Beck first presented his design to the London Underground, it was initially rejected as too radical. But when it was finally published in 1933, it was an instant hit with the public. Passengers found it much easier to plan their journeys using Beck's schematic approach. The design was so successful that it became the template for transit maps around the world, from New York to Tokyo. Beck's map is a perfect example of how understanding Gestalt principles can lead to breakthrough innovations. By recognizing that our brains naturally seek out patterns and relationships, he was able to create a visual representation that aligned with our cognitive tendencies. The result was a design that not only solved a practical problem, but also changed the way people conceptualized urban space. Case Study 3. The Taste of Beauty. Now, let's move from the world of maps and machines to the realm of sensory experience. Imagine you're seated at a high-end restaurant, eagerly anticipating your meal. The waiter approaches with your first course, and as he sets the plate before you, you can't help but gasp. The dish is a work of art, a harmony of colors, shapes, and textures that seems almost too beautiful to eat. What you're experiencing is the result of careful application of Gestalt principles to the art of food presentation, or plating. Top chefs understand that we eat with our eyes first, and they use this knowledge to create dishes that are not just delicious, but visually captivating. Let's break down how Gestalt principles come into play in culinary presentation. Proximity. Chefs often group similar elements together on the plate, creating distinct zones that guide the diner's eye and suggest how the dish should be eaten. A cluster of colorful vegetables might be placed near a protein, suggesting a perfect bite that combines both elements. Similarity. Colors and shapes are carefully chosen to create coherence or contrast. A chef might use a recurring circular motif throughout the dish, round slices of radish echoing a ring of sauce, for example, to create a sense of unity. Closure. Negative space is as important as the food itself. By leaving parts of the plate empty, chefs can create implied lines or shapes that the diner's brain automatically completes. A sauce might be artfully dragged across the plate, suggesting motion and guiding the eye. Continuity. The arrangement of elements often follows smooth, flowing lines. This could be a curved arrangement of small components, leading to the main focus of the dish, creating a sense of movement and direction. Figure ground. The main protein or star ingredient is often positioned as the figure, with sauces, garnishes, and accompaniments forming the ground. This hierarchy helps diners immediately understand the composition of the dish. Consider the work of chef Grant Achatz at Alinea in Chicago. One of his famous dishes, an edible helium balloon made of green apple taffy, plays with our expectations of figure-ground relationships. The transparent balloon becomes the figure against the backdrop of the dining room, challenging our perception of what constitutes food and plating. Or think about how sushi chefs use the principle of similarity to create visually striking rolls, with carefully arranged patterns of fish, rice, and nori. The repetition of shapes and colors creates a sense of order and beauty that enhances the dining experience. But here's where it gets really interesting. The application of Gestalt principles in plating doesn't just make food look pretty, it can actually influence how we perceive its taste. Studies have shown that the visual presentation of food can affect our expectations and even our subjective experience of flavor. A well-plated dish might literally taste better to us than the same ingredients arranged haphazardly. This phenomenon speaks to the deep interconnections between our senses and our cognitive processes. The Gestalt principles that govern visual perception also influence how we integrate information from other senses, shaping our overall experience of the world. Beyond the visual, Gestalt in everyday life. While we've focused primarily on visual examples, it's important to recognize that Gestalt principles extend far beyond what we can see. They reflect fundamental aspects of how our brains process and organize information across all sensory modalities. In music, for instance, we perceive melodies as coherent wholes rather than individual notes, an auditory application of the principle of continuity. In language, our tendency towards closure helps us understand speech, even when some sounds are masked by background noise. We don't hear every phoneme. Our brains fill in the gaps based on context and expectation. These principles also shape our social perceptions and interactions. We naturally group people based on proximity. Think of how you perceive couples at a party, or similarity, the tendency to assume people dressed alike are together. Our drive for closure leads us to make snap judgments about others based on limited information, filling in the blanks to create a complete picture of their personality or intentions. In the digital realm, user interface designers leverage Gestalt principles to create intuitive, user-friendly experiences. The grouping of related functions in software menus relies on proximity and similarity. The use of white space in web design plays with figure-ground relationships to direct attention and create visual hierarchy. Even in abstract thinking and problem-solving, we can see the influence of Gestalt-like processes. Our tendency to seek patterns and create wholes from disparate parts underlies much of human creativity and innovation. When we have an aha moment, connecting previously unrelated ideas to form a new insight, we're engaging in a kind of cognitive closure. Understanding these principles, then, isn't just about explaining visual illusions or appreciating good design. It's about gaining insight into the fundamental ways our minds make sense of the world. By recognizing these cognitive tendencies, we can become more aware of our own perceptual biases and more adept at communicating and problem-solving. The limits of Gestalt. However, it's crucial to remember that while Gestalt principles are powerful, they're not infallible. Our brain's eagerness to find patterns and create wholes can sometimes lead us astray. This is particularly evident in phenomena like pareidolia, where we see faces in inanimate objects, or apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. These cognitive quirks, while usually harmless, can have serious consequences in certain contexts. In fields like scientific research or criminal investigation, the desire to see patterns can lead to false conclusions, if not tempered by rigorous critical thinking. The history of science is littered with examples of researchers seeing significance in random fluctuations, leading to erroneous theories and wasted effort. Moreover, our perceptual tendencies can be exploited by those who understand them. Marketers and propagandists have long used Gestalt principles to create persuasive and sometimes misleading messages. The power of these principles to shape perception and influence behavior raises important ethical questions about their use in advertising, political campaigning, and other forms of mass communication. It's also worth noting that while Gestalt principles seem to be largely universal, there is some variation across cultures and individuals. Research has shown that people from different cultural backgrounds may have slightly different tendencies in visual processing. This serves as a reminder that while these principles are deeply ingrained, they're not immutable laws of nature, but rather evolved cognitive strategies that can be influenced by experience and context. Conclusion. From the battlefields of World War II to the kitchens of haute cuisine, Gestalt principles shape our perception and interaction with the world in profound and often invisible ways. They remind us that our experience of reality is not a passive reception of sensory data, but an active process of interpretation and meaning-making. As we navigate an increasingly complex and information-rich world, understanding these principles becomes ever more crucial. They offer a toolkit for designing more effective communication, creating more intuitive technologies, and perhaps even gaining a deeper understanding of our own cognitive processes. But perhaps the most valuable lesson from Gestalt psychology is the reminder that our perceptions are not always reliable. The very cognitive mechanisms that help us make sense of the world can also lead us to see patterns where none exist, or to miss important details that don't fit our preconceived notions. In an era of information overload and fake news, cultivating this kind of perceptual self-awareness is more important than ever. So the next time you look at a map, admire a beautifully plated meal, or find yourself marveling at an optical illusion, take a moment to consider the invisible principles at work. How might your perception be shaped by proximity, similarity, or closure? What wholes are you creating from the parts before you? And most importantly, what might you be missing? Share your thoughts in a comment below.